Good afternoon, William and Mary. Welcome, everybody. This month, March 2021, William and Mary is relaunching our strategic planning process. Many of you will recall that we paused planning exactly a year ago in March. As the pandemic took hold, we needed to create space to navigate the crisis and to focus on the near term. The incredible efforts from faculty and staff, students, and neighbors have sustained William and Mary this year. As Dr. Fauci emphasized when he spoke to me a month ago, this is a critical moment in the course of the pandemic in which we must remain vigilant, focused on safeguarding the health of our community. And we also need to take the time to explore the important signs of hope that we are seeing, especially with the increasing vaccine supply in our region and beyond. And as importantly, a year into pandemic, we have seen profound changes in our community in the way that we have pursued what we've accomplished. And this is the right time to start taking stock of how we've changed. So with that hope and commitment and continuing vigilance, I'm restarting the strategic planning process that we paused with the defined period of reflection. Today's community conversation kicks off that reflection process for the community. Imagine here that we are going through a process of reflecting and then visioning, defining a high level set of priorities, and then moving into focused action. That's the rhythm of this restart. I'm going to start with a quick overview of our updated goals and how we want to re-engage the community. And then I'm going to introduce our speakers for a conversation that we hope will model the kinds of reflection we want to engage all of this community in over the next 6 weeks. So here's a quick refresher on phases 1 and 2 of strategic planning. This is where we were. Our aim is to revisit but not repeat the important and thorough work that we did. You'll remember that we developed as a community over about 10 months our new vision, mission, and values statements, and that we have used those every day under pandemic. We also undertook with expanded subcommittees of the Strategic Planning Committee 3 thoroughgoing environmental scans. And those environmental scans resulted in 3 white papers and a digested set of assumptions for the community that we're going to govern planning. We're going to restart by reflecting on those white papers again and those assumptions in a formal way for 6 weeks and ask you a set of questions that we want you to give us feedback on, which we're going to kick off today. The idea is to use pandemic as a kind of stress test of our assumptions and of our environmental scan of the critical issues facing higher education and William and Mary right now. As you'll see, we have a new timeline for this 3rd phase of strategic planning that pauses for reflection for about 6 weeks, and then that moves through after that playback of what we've learned from the community, delivers that playback to cabinet for focused priority setting with me as president. We're going to bring those priorities to the board in the summer at the board retreat and formally publish them out to the community together with 2 new key initiatives. One is to focus on a 3-year action plan that corresponds to the challenging phase of recovery after pandemic. And the other is to invite every unit and department who wishes to create their own 3-year action plan. As you see, we've added a new goal to the 2 original goals of strategic planning. And that new goal is to preserve the momentum, the positive momentum that we have achieved under pandemic. What have we learned that we need to carry forward into the next 3 years and 10 years? So this conversation is kicking off those questions. How have we changed? How have we matured? What do we want to continue with and what do we want to set aside? Those are the questions of the next 6 weeks and really of the next 3 years formally for this institution. This conversation is about those key questions, about exploring them in the light of the last year, not yet about the answers that we will come to, because we actually think those answers are going to be ones that evolve over the next 3 years in a swift way together in the community. So let me introduce our panelists. Our provost, Peggy Aguris, who was the co-chair of the Strategic Planning Steering Committee. Welcome. Carl Friedrichs, who is the Glucksman Professor and Associate Director of the Chesapeake Bay National Estuarine Research Reserve in Virginia, who is a co-author of our Research and Innovation white paper. Kathy Forrestal, Director of Neuroscience and Associate Professor of Psychological Sciences, who is the co-author of our Teaching and Learning white paper. And Suzanne Raitt, Chancellor Professor of English, who is the co-author of our Flourishing and Engagement white paper. So thank you all for being here. I'm just going to say a few things to remind everybody about what those white papers did. They gave us some immediate takeaways of the deep environmental scan that you did with this community, with experts in this community and beyond, looking outside of William and Mary. They focused on 5 themes as we brought them back together: collaboration, the need to break down silos and to think as a whole university about the opportunities that we can achieve when we break down silos, the need to cultivate an entrepreneurial mindset, and the critical need to advance financial sustainability and to make the case for liberal arts in the 21st century and for higher ed more generally. So those 5 themes threaded through your 3 white papers. You all led that scan process, and we've asked you in advance of this call to revisit those white papers. I want to kick us off first with the larger question: how have our assumptions changed, and maybe how have they matured, for about 10 minutes? And Peggy, I'll start by asking you at a very high level, can you tell us how the pandemic has shifted our thinking about what we want the future of William & Mary to look like?
Yes, it's without a doubt that we went through, and we're still going through, a significant global crisis. So we discovered a lot of things that I think that we should preserve for our future. One of them is that we like being together, and we like to be on campus. The value that we always held dear, the value of belonging, I think that it became even more real as we went through this crisis. We learned how to be more flexible. And it is important to remember that flexibility is not an abstract term. We had an opportunity to implement various ways of coming back to our mission and educating our students. And flexibility supported us while we were doing this. We also changed our ways of doing certain things by including more innovative approaches, technology, various ways of delivering our educational mission. And I think that what we want to maintain and keep for our future is a combination of what we learn to do differently, that we still value being together and taking care of each other, and being open and caring. We also learn, to become more flexible and more innovative. And we want to maintain the identity and the values of our institution while strengthening how we do things in a way that preserves our mission and vision, but shows that we can be more inclusive, more flexible, and more innovative in a positive manner.
I thought it was really striking over the course of the last 2 semesters, as the faculty have doubled down on remote learning skills because we needed to and our students needed that. It's been striking to see how important community building is for the learning process, how much of an impact it has on the effectiveness of learning, on the speed of learning for many, many students, particularly for those who are first-gen students who are underrepresented and who are non-traditional students. That community of learning with faculty matters enormously. Carl, I'll start you off with your white paper on research and innovation. How has your thinking about that evolved as you revisit that white paper?
Well, the need to break down silos, as you mentioned earlier, was one of the strongest themes that we identified in the research and innovation white paper. That still holds. But before the pandemic, I hadn't realized the full potential of using virtual spaces and technologies to connect diverse researchers and innovators. When we wrote our white paper pre-COVID, we specifically emphasized that more in-person collaborative spaces were essential, and they still are, but we didn't put as large a focus on the potential of virtual spaces. But I think the last year has shown us that there can be advantages to virtual spaces. for diversifying our exchange of ideas. For example, based on my own personal experience, well, I think William & Mary students, faculty, and staff are now attending more international seminars than they did pre-COVID, but without the travel costs and without the large carbon footprint. Likewise, I've seen underrepresented voices from outside William & Mary being included in our research seminars more often because the logistics of their attendance is simplified so much by technological platforms such as Zoom. But of course, we are losing out in other ways by having reduced in-person interaction. And of course, face-to-face in-person connections are essential, as the provost emphasized. But as we continue to rethink or expand collaborative spaces for in-person get-togethers at William & Mary, I think that maintaining an ability to include virtual attendance in a meaningful way will also be very important, especially in the context of research and innovation when we're trying to gather ideas from all around the world.
Thanks. Kathy, I'd love you to chime in for the same question. As you revisited your teaching and learning white paper, what struck you a year in after pandemic?
Well, I think first of all, what struck me was just how well they held up. But I think when we were writing these papers, we assumed that developing and establishing online learning practices was going to be a heavy lift for certain units in our community, certain units across the university. However, the pandemic has provided us with a new level of comfort with online learning. Many of us are now familiar with the practices and tools that provide rich learning experiences for many of our students. But we're also more familiar with the challenges and pitfalls that exist with online learning. And I think we're better prepared now to deal with some of those issues. We also gained better awareness of the value that Steely provides as an institutional partner. Steely has been there for us, providing tips, tools.
Tell us the acronym, Steely. Tell us the
acronym. Now I'm blanking on it now. Our Teaching and Learning Institute.
Learning innovation.
Thank you.
Well,
I'm so used to calling it Steely now.
Exactly, which is really a great testament to how important it has become in our lives, that we really have, everybody knows the acronym.
Yes, yeah. And, I think as faculty, we felt supported by them. And so we're just reminded of the role of collaboration, both within our departments, with Steely, and it teaches us that what we can achieve when we work together.
You said a heavy lift, and it was a heavy lift. I just want to acknowledge that. But there's a reason why William & Mary is tied for fourth with Princeton for best undergraduate teaching in the country. Our faculty did that lift together, and that accelerated the learning process really profoundly. So every word you just said, Kathy, together, right? Collaboration and the real dedication to transforming that heavy lift, to taking that heavy lift because it mattered for our students. It's one of the things I'm going to take away and remember for years. Suzanne, let me bring you in with that lovely note on the community of practice among faculty and graduate students who are teaching. You co-authored the white paper on flourishing and engagement. What struck you as you reread it a year into pandemic?
Well, it was interesting because, as Kathy has said, I wouldn't say that the white paper has sort of lost any of its relevance. But on the other hand, some aspects of what I said there, or what we said there, have now really jump out to me after the pandemic. So I would say probably my top takeaway is that we wrote about diversity and belonging, and we wrote about inequity, and we wrote about social justice. But what the pandemic and also the murder of George Floyd has really brought home to all of us is that those inequities, social inequities, economic, racial, they cut really deep, right down to the bedrock. Some people have survived the pandemic and done even better than they did before. Others have lost almost everything. And I think that in terms of institutional flourishing, individual flourishing at William and Mary, we have to put our revived understanding of those inequities at the center of any vision for what we're doing. You know, using everything that we've learned about innovation, about different ways of learning, to bring into our community new groups of students, new ways of thinking, new ways of being, and make sure that we do it with an eye to equity and to inclusion.
Yeah, I want to add affordability and its urgency, particularly for those students that are most vulnerable, to the list of things that you just said, that is intensely more pressing now because of that K-shaped recovery. We in a wonderful first community conversation this last January, just a month ago, our guests, who are a number of alumni and faculty and graduate students, all talked in different ways about how what we already know has more value, more relevance, more intense urgency now. And that's a really profound discovery, I think, that there are things that we have known that we now need to grapple with much more quickly and more directly. So appreciate that emphasis on strengthening the insights of that white paper. This is a question for all three of you. Is there something that we didn't include in the white papers that, as you reread them, you think we now should consider including? Go ahead and jump in.
Well, you know, I think, of course, nobody anticipated that, 2 months after we wrote our white papers, everybody's world would change. And when I was reflecting on this, I was thinking, well, strategic planning is about a process of change. But normally our institutions change and we change with them in a planned way, in a strategic way. And what we had to do under the pandemic was to change very, very fast in ways that we probably didn't want to change. And I think what I learned from the past year is that we have to be patient with each other. You know, we have to understand that actually change is hard. And the people we work with, the people we live with, the people we learn with won't get it right the first time. And that's okay. That's part of what change does. So I think that was my biggest takeaway.
I was really amazed by how fast we responded in so many ways, but in terms of my own viewpoint on research and innovation, I thought that innovation in the use of virtual technology went so quickly and went so well, considering how hard it was. I was really amazed. And I don't think when we were writing our research and innovation white paper, we imagined that we could be doing so much so well. So it's almost like we went 5 years in technology in only 1 year.
And that's the same for teaching too. I mean, we had to transition so quickly, getting our courses online in a week, essentially. And as we said before, we realized that some faculty and students do not thrive under these conditions. And well, others do, you know, so I think we really have to step back and think about how we're going to develop flexible ways to continue to engage and inspire students as we're transitioning to these different modes of learning for the longer term.
As we talk about and imagine a 3-year action plan, that is exactly one of the key hopes that I have for every academic department and all those who are supporting the co-curriculum, is to say, how can these new tools help us meet our mission better in a flexible way? Because we did learn, that's one of the huge takeaways. Flexibility was what allowed students, our flexibility, our faculty and staff's flexibility, is what allowed students to choose the best path for each of them under pandemic. And that was hard. It would have been easier to choose one mode of teaching, all remote. Instead, we opted for 3 modes: remote, in person, and blended. And the maturation that came with that was very fast, very hard won. And it's now over the next 3 years on us to think about what do we do with that maturation, I think. Anything else besides what you've already said that you would want to add that gained more importance in your view, in your white papers?
The importance of our international students as part of our community. We certainly talked about the importance of internationalization and taking the brand abroad. But over this past, year, many of our international students have not been with us. And I think that's a shame.
And this is a cosmopolitan community. That is something we aspire to.
Yeah.
Profound.
We felt the difference. I mean,
Yeah.
this is really, I really emphasize this as one of the things that we felt.
Other aspects, several of you have said that face-to-face learning has gained a new kind of importance. Anything else that we have missed as you read those white papers that has gained in importance?
I think go ahead.
I mean, it was weird to think about flourishing and engagement after a year that has just been, fairly disastrous for many people. When I look back over this year, I would say, yes, William and Mary has flourished in the sense that, we have continued, we have helped students learn, we've supported employees, we've kept things going, we've adapted, we've found ways to do it. So yes, we have flourished, but what we've lost is the kind of engagement that you get when you're together. Mm-hmm. And I think because we just didn't imagine that that was going to happen, we started to understand that in order to be together, we have to do it in a particular and ethical way, that we have to wear masks, we have to stay apart from one another. And I'm hoping that one of the things that is going to be a hallmark of the way we move forward is understanding that we have all forms of responsibility towards one another. It's not just about our physical health, it's about our mental health, it's about helping one another to feel part of things and to belong. And I think nobody could have predicted the kind of year we were going to have and how important those things were going to become.
I think we, in the innovation discussions, we talked some about the stereotype that has some truth, that faculty with their handbooks and their ways of doing things and their tenure are among the most inflexible in some ways of many professions. And we were worried that innovating would be something that it's just hard to make faculty especially think outside the box. But then when we saw what happened under the pandemic, we were so flexible, everyone was, students, staff, the administration, and it really opened our eyes to the potential of innovation and the exciting advances we can make, which we thought, I felt that if someone had told me what was going to happen, I don't think I would have thought we'd do nearly as well as we had with our flexibility.
Yeah, it's a pretty astonishing thing. I agree with you, Carl. I can't imagine another time in my career when I would have said that the institution that I was at is distinguished by its flexibility. And that is really true of William & Mary and of much of higher ed this year. So something to dwell on a lot, I think. What are the gains and what have the challenges been of that? Let me shift a little bit to what we want to carry forward, because we've talked a lot about maturation as an organization, very swift, forced, and yet embraced in some powerful ways, maturation. I'm interested in what you would want to carry forward, and if there's anything that you think we could lay aside now, do differently. Suzanne, do you want to start us off?
Well, we've talked a lot about how important it is to, be together physically, not just for academic reasons, but also for personal reasons. We need to be able to touch each other again and laugh together again and, gather in the sunken gardens, play frisbee. We've had housekeepers working completely alone We've had staff working completely alone in buildings. And, you know, it may be safer, but it's also incredibly demoralizing. So I do think that we've really learnt the value of the physical, the importance of place in that sense. You know, I can't think of anything that I would lay aside from our white paper, but I suppose the other thing that's leapt out to me is how vulnerable our financial model makes us. And, you know, obviously we're not alone in that. You know, almost every organization in the country has found that it's vulnerable in ways that it couldn't anticipate. But of course, one of the results of that is that we need to try and strengthen, diversify our sources of revenue, if we can find new sources of revenue, and also recognize that, you know, we've made it through this year through everyone's hard work and effort, but that financial vulnerability really affects people's lives. You know, these are people who are impacted by institutional shortfalls, policies, and you know, I know that for everybody, trying to protect people's livelihoods and their well-being is at the heart of our efforts. So that leapt out to me as something that we really want to focus on going forward.
Yes, that's partly why I've added this 3-year action phase to the outcomes of the strategic planning process, so that we have a place to start that corresponds with what I think will be 3 tough years as we move through all of the kinds of areas of focus you just described, thinking about new sources of revenue, thinking about new ways that students can pursue their degrees and do so in a way that's affordable, and pursuing the kinds of flexibility you've all talked about. So we'll come back to that. We'll come back to that again. Kathy, your thoughts about what we're going to carry forward and anything that we might want to lay aside.
So the pandemic has challenged many of our assumptions of how effective teaching and learning should look. And over the past year, we've learned a lot of fancy new skills in order to enhance our students' learning. So we're more convinced that we can teach our students and they can learn from afar. But some of us, and in addition, some of us have actually discovered we can do research remotely with our students, and that they can be effective partners in that type of setting. But on the other hand, it's important to remember that some students and faculty struggled with teaching, as I mentioned before, and learning and engagement over the past year. And of course, there are some areas of scholarship where it's difficult to provide students with effective experiences virtually. You know, think of research in a wet lab, for example. So I think it's imperative that we consider these individual differences as we plan ahead for post-pandemic teaching. Flexibility is really going to be key. Offering a range of experiences that include online, face-to-face, and blended learning will honor these differences. And the flexibility will allow us to also serve those who choose not to be on campus. So flexibility, I think, is something that we're really going to want to focus on.
I think one of the great areas for both caution and innovation is in thinking about what it means to work in both modes for staff, as well as for faculty, for graduate students, as well as for undergrads. There's so many opportunities, as you say. You could imagine a student taking remote courses and pursuing a 6-month internship at the same time. Graduate students in particular, new paths to graduate degrees that allows students to work and do degrees much more flexibly from William & Mary, let's say, thinking out loud. And yet it means that those supporting those students in those degrees are going to be always working in 2 modes.
Yeah.
So we have to be attentive to the doubling as well as the gaining of flexibility, the doubling of work as well as the gaining of flexibility, and ask what kinds of work is it okay to lay aside so that we can gain that flexibility. That's the hardest question, I think, for most in higher ed, because we are very reluctant to lay aside the things that we do because we do them so well. So I just have that as an open question for the community. That lay aside question really matters because it's what enables the gains in flexibility. Carl, what would you add about what we're carrying forward and what we might lay aside?
Well, when you were mentioning internships, I think there's a lot of exciting opportunities for partnerships that support internships in creative ways. And our research and innovation white paper strongly recommended in the future, William & Mary should expand our partnerships with industry, the public sector, and nonprofits. We also recommend collaborating regionally, nationally, and globally, and there could be some really exciting technology-aided remote internships. Our successes with virtual connections during the pandemic can be leveraged for these long-distance collaborations. But we also felt that our partnerships should build on our strengths. We shouldn't try to expand in all directions. We believe that we'll do best with partnerships that benefit most strongly from a liberal arts perspective that integrates humanities and sciences. Interdisciplinary collaborations also play to our strengths, both for partnerships across departments and schools within William & Mary and also for collaborations outside of the university. The research and innovation white paper also recommended that a university-wide process continue for brainstorming regarding collaborative opportunities and approaches. And we're doing that. You're recommending that right now, which is great. And I'm also pleased that our Vice Provost for Research and Graduate and Professional Studies has already scheduled a series of research and innovation workshops this spring. These will be focusing primarily on reducing silos and fostering expanded collaboration, which were two of the themes we brought up today.
I want to just riff one more on that because we have seen that reducing silos and fostering collaboration just take off among administrators and staff. Every single part of our pandemic response has succeeded because there are professionals from multiple different units and different parts of the institution engaged in that, whether it's our public health response or it's the team that is thinking about virtual wellness work. And really across the board, we've seen multidisciplinary, that's the word I'd want to use on the staff and administrative side, multidisciplinary teams as the key to a successful pandemic response. And I want us to think really hard about how we foster more of that whole university, multi-expertise mode of work. It's been so effective.
Yeah, in research, we often call that transdisciplinary thinking, where you even do it. You can't do it between their specialties even. You need to have both their specialties.
Yes. Yes, so our public health advisory team is such a good example. You need somebody from IT who understands health data, right? And you need epidemiologists, and you need physicians, and you need somebody who oversees operations. So that's the beautiful example of transdisciplinary team-based work, and it's stood us in such good stead. We're incredibly fortunate. So I want that to, and for the whole community that's listening, to invite you to think really hard about how we extend that rapid maturation and transdisciplinary work, both on the staff and faculty sides, on both sides of our mission. Peggy, do you want to close us out by saying a little bit more about that larger question that I kicked us off with, how we make the case for higher education right now, as we're beginning to see a path out of pandemic? We're not out. I don't want to say that, but we're beginning to see a path out.
Yes, we are. And let's keep focusing on the light at the end of the proverbial tunnel. It gets us through a lot of things. So before we entered the pandemic, higher education was kind of questioned in terms of the value of the model of delivery of education to the students, with online being so prominent and cheaper and free courses. So what we discovered, actually not some of us and the majority of academics already already knew that, but I think that the world discovered that higher education is a public good, that we need to be together. We need to offer education through personal interactions as well, that students and faculty and staff members thrive when they are together. And that if anything, what happened was the accentuation of the sense of belonging that we're looking for through higher education, the equalizing factor of higher education, providing a safe haven and capabilities to students who might not have them at home. So being the safe and warm environment that allows people to flourish, even if their personal conditions and circumstances are not conducive to that. We learned how higher education can shift focus towards careers and pathways towards finding your goal in life. And we've seen it materialize again and again. And ultimately, I think that we have provided support and service to the community in an expansive sense through many ways that were made obvious through this pandemic. At William and Mary, I'm going to only bring a couple of examples because there are so many. Our business school working to empower and support local businesses, and our School of Education working with local schools to support faculty and students. So overall, this is the silver lining in a very difficult crisis for the world. The fact that higher education emerged not only as a passive supporter, but as an active contributor to the pathway towards the exit of this out of this pandemic.
And that was one of our mission goals from the beginning, to see ourselves through and to find a way to do that, as Suzanne said, to see ourselves through together in any way that we could. So I want to thank all of you, Peggy, Suzanne, and Kathy and Carl, and to thank everyone who joined us today virtually. We got, I think, a really good sense of how exciting it is and how generative it is, generative to revisit these white papers. We're inviting the whole community to engage in this kind of generative reflection over the next 6 weeks by revisiting these white papers, perhaps with your department or your unit, and by answering the questions that we posed today. How have we changed? What do we want to carry forward? What do we now want to lay aside? And then by reflecting back your answers to us, your analysis, by the end of April, we've set up a feedback form, as you'll see at the strategic planning site. And in May, we're going to be returning as a group, having read your input, your feedback, and we'll play it back to you as a community, what we've learned from this phase of reflection in a community conversation in May. We'll hand that over to Cabinet, who will use what we learn in this phase of reflection to shape a strategic direction at a high level for the university over the coming years and to map out a 3-year action plan. And then we're going to be engaging departments and units in thinking through their 3-year action plan corresponding to the overall direction of the university. So this is the beginning of a brief, and I hope you will find really generative homework assignment. Thank you for helping to shape the future of the alma mater of the nation. Stay well, William and Mary.